Can AI be used effectively for feedback and grading? Jen Roberts is here to tell us how she does it.
Welcome to the DIESOL podcast, where we focus on developing innovation in English as a second or other language. I'm Brent Warner, professor of ESL at Irvine Valley College, and I'm here as always with the amazing Ixchell Reyes. Ixchell, how's it going?
It's going. By the time you hear this episode, I will be running around like a chicken with its head cut off, trying to get ready to travel overseas.
That's right. So I came back and settled in, and now you're leaving. So here we go
Yeah.
again.
But you're teaching, you're back in the
I
classroom.
am teaching and back in the classroom. So it's good to be back talking about a lot of these things about using AI with students. And so today, I think both of us are very happy to have the Jen Roberts joining and telling us about how she uses AI with her students in feedback and grading. And so, Ixchell, let's jump over to talking with Jen.
Jumping right in.
Okay, so we are happy to bring onto the show Jen Roberts. Jen, you and I know each other for a while, quite a while, I think. Time is disappearing on me, but through Q. But for anyone who doesn't know, Jen Roberts is a nationally board certified high school English teacher with more than 25 years of experience teaching English language arts and social science in grades 7 through 12. She is the author of Power Up, Making the Shift to One-to-One, Teaching and Learning, and a Google for Education Certified Innovator since 2011. So, Jen, you've been doing this stuff for a long time. Interests include literacy instruction, leveraging technology to make teaching more efficient and effective. And the wonderful blog at litandtech.com is your baby there. And it's been a go-to for a lot of people over the years. So, Jen, we're really happy to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, Jen, one of the things that we really wanted to talk to you today about, we're kind of jumping right in, is the AI conversation. And you had an article where you were featured from, I think it was Cal Matters, where it talked about you, a few other people as well, but you were kind of featured about using AI both for feedback and for grading, and what that conversation looks like. And I know it's kind of a hot button conversation for a lot of people. Some people are scared of it. Some people are interested in it. Some people are totally unaware of it. But let's just kind of get right into it, which is what's happening in your class, right? Like, let's get that big picture here.
So I'm actually working on a new blog post just about that, almost that exact question. What's happening in my class? So the AI for grading, I kind of think the grading part is sort of the third rail of AI, and I'm happy to talk about it, but let's talk about the feedback part first, because I think that's a little more interesting, and what it's doing with my students. And, I started using feedback kind of cautiously with my seniors. I figured they're seniors, they can handle things that are a little more interesting. And I started with Brisk, and I had about 30 minutes one day to go through all of their final papers from first semester. And I wanted to leave them all some feedback, just because they were about to have about an hour of peer feedback and then another hour of final revisions. And I thought I would like to leave them some of my feedback before they get to those things. I didn't have time, obviously, to do that in the traditional method. So I used Brisk, and I dropped AI feedback onto every one of their papers in under 30 minutes. And then they came in and they did their writing response group with their peers. And I sat back and realized that was a richer experience, because even though they'd been doing writing response group with their peers for, most of the semester, when the AI feedback was there as well, their conversation wasn't just about the paper they were reading. It was also about the validity of that AI feedback. And they ended up sort of agreeing with some of it and disagreeing with some of it, and that was fine. But I just loved that it added to that conversation. It also prompted them to have conversations about things that I don't think they would have come to on their own. So because the AI feedback was suggesting certain moves that the writer could make, that became part of the discussion in the group.
Hmm.
And then they'd go to the next person's paper, and they were using some of the feedback from the AI to the previous paper and applying that to the next paper to see, would this work here too? So it upped the level of their conversation about the student work. And then the student writers themselves who got that feedback got a chance to process. They all knew it was AI feedback. I labeled it really clearly. They got a chance to process what that AI feedback was telling them about their paper. And then they had one more hour of writing time to do some final revisions and submit that. And the feedback from my seniors was that was really helpful. They really liked that. So I then moved into putting some brisk feedback on my ninth graders' papers and things like that. And that sort of ended up something like this. I'd sit down with a group of kids. It's writing workshop time. People are all writing. And I'd say, who's ready for AI feedback? And a brave child would raise their hand. And I'd say, okay, go, here you go. Here's your AI feedback. And I'd say, who's next? And there'd be like two other kids who were ready and two other kids who were like, oh, not yet. And one kid who was like, no, I don't want that at all. And so I'd move around the room and I'd end up giving AI feedback to about half the kids while putting my own eyeballs on it as well. Like I had to open their paper and I'd have to look it over and see how much they'd written and see what direction they were going. And I'd spit out the AI feedback and it would pretty much match what I would want to say. But I would drop it on there and I'd move on to the next student. And if at some point someone would say to me, is this feedback good? And I'd say, I don't know. What do you think? It's your paper, right? And that was kind of powerful. It's like I wasn't the one vetting the feedback. I mean, I was making sure that it at least, it wasn't completely crazy. And it never was. It was always, very good. Brisk does a really good job making sure the feedback is actually applicable to what the students are writing. It might not always encapsulate everything that it was in the assignment, because when Brisk looks at the student paper, it doesn't necessarily know what the assignment was. It could know what the rubric is if I give it to it. And especially when I gave it the rubric, the feedback was pretty spot on. And what I would say to my students is, I'm not coming with you to college. You have to learn to read the feedback for yourself and decide if it's valid for you or not. And if you have a question, I'm right here. Like, please, if you think the AI feedback is wrong, raise your hand, call me over. We'll look at it together. I would love to do that with you. And overall, students found that feedback was pretty darn helpful. The problem was I was still the gatekeeper. And that meant that I needed to be physically present with the kid. Well, I didn't have to be physically present, but the kid had to be ready for the feedback. And I wasn't going to drop AI feedback onto a ninth grader who wasn't ready for it. And what I found was they weren't always ready for it when I was ready to give it. And some of them were kind of never ready for it. And some of them were like, oh, I want feedback, but don't look at my paper. I'm like, well, I can't not look at your paper while giving you feedback, even with AI. And so that was challenging. And then by the end of the school year, Magic School had released Magic Student. And I was able to say, okay, here's your feedback room. When you're ready for feedback, you click this link, you drop in your paper or what you've written so far, and it'll tell you what your feedback is. And the participation went way up. They really liked that because they didn't have to show it to me.
Yeah.
And that was kind of fabulous. It's like they didn't like things they weren't ready to show me yet. I try to be really non-judgmental in my classroom, but there's still that element of like, I don't want to show anyone yet. They were going and getting multiple iterations of AI feedback and their writing got better. They really liked that.
So Jen, I want to sort of step back just a little bit. We have of course talked about Brisk and also Magic School on the show, but we do have several listeners who are probably going to be introduced to these tools for the first time today as they're listening to you. And I just want to make sure everybody knows that Brisk is a Chrome extension, correct? And I actually don't know how long it's been around, but I've recently discovered it maybe half a year ago or so.
It's been around, I think it's going on, at least it's a year and a half, perhaps.
Okay, yeah. So for me, it's brand new and it's blown me away. And then you also mentioned Magic School AI, and that is a separate tool. That's not an extension, correct? So you're using both of those.
Magic School AI is a website. You go to the website. From there, you can click a button that says launch to students and you pick the tools that you want students to have access to, which is kind of fabulous. So I'll use the feedback tool and the sentence starter tool and the idea generator or whatever it is they need, because I want AI to lower the cognitive load for my students so that they're able to produce writing.
Right.
And that's different for every kid. So everybody needs something a little different out of it.
So Jen, I have something similar that I do in my class for the very first writing assignment that they do, which is, they do a writing assignment on day one of class. Then I get it back, and then I give them the feedback. Now I did mine a little sneaky because the first time, because it's part of the conversation, which is I gave them this feedback from. I think I did it through Bing or sorry, Bing. It's Copilot.
Bing.
Copilot.
Yeah, so it's through Copilot and or ChatGPT in one of these ones. So the idea was let them look at the feedback, let them analyze that feedback, and then we kind of pulled back into the conversation of like, hey, by the way, this is AI. Now, what do you think about it differently? So it was a little bit of a surprise, but also kind of introducing and opening up the conversation around AI. Moving forward, I will always tell them when it's AI, but the first time was kind of like, just like a trick and a little fun. But I noticed that one thing interesting that happened, because I went on sabbatical for a year. The first time I did it in spring of 2023, there were quite a lot of mistakes on the feedback, and there were, like little things that were weird. And this time around, a year, so fall of 2024, it's like, whoa, wait a second, there's not much wrong with this feedback overall. And so before, it was opening up a conversation with my students like, hey, let's take a look at where some of the problem areas are. Yes, let's analyze it in terms of your work, or you kind of seeing what you understand from this. But I'm also a little sad that it's as good as it is, because now I'm a little worried that it incentivizes them to just say, oh, well, I can just use this, or, I can just have it write these things. And so how are you dealing with, I mean, it's an interesting thing when it's such good quality, right? And are you interacting with that same issue, and have you dealt with it?
I'm not having an issue with the feedback getting better. That seems to be very okay with me. I really appreciate that the tools allow me to upload a rubric. When I add the rubric and the feedback is tailored to the rubric, that definitely helps my students and motivates them, because they do. I mean, we would love for kids to just write things because they feel like writing, but we know that grades are a motivating factor and they want a better grade. And that's a piece of that. And so what I appreciated about Magic Student, the shift there was it empowered the students. It empowered the students to get their own feedback when they were ready for it, at the moment they were ready for it, 4 or 5 multiple times if they wanted it. And students who would never have called me over and said, I'm ready for feedback, I found them putting their writing through Magic School 4, 5, 6 times. And getting better each time.
On the back end of that, because I haven't used it in a teaching context. I've used it, playing with it alone, but not with my students. Can you monitor what's going on from that, so you have access to see what's happening?
So if I am curious about any particular student's conversation with a Magic School tool, I can go in and see every single thing that was exchanged between the student and the tool. In practice, do I review all of that? No. Because, I have 140 students, and if they're all using Magic Student 4 or 5 times, I'm actually, what I want to spend my time looking at is their writing, not the feedback they got on their writing, right? So, but the empowering piece of it is what's really cool. And then this year, it's become less it's moving even earlier in the writing process. And my 9th graders were writing just last week. They had to write a piece about, their name and what it meant to them, right? Like, no, that wasn't the one. The one that they were writing about that we ended up responding to was the single story. So we watched Chimamanda Adichie's fabulous TED Talk about the single story. And we read a great essay. I'm blanking on his first name, but Dr. Stevens wrote about his single story experience. And then I asked them to write about a time when they had a single story about someone else, or someone else had a single story about them, right? It's just a narrative practice, because we're in a narrative unit. And I gave them early access to a feedback room. And what I found was I have a lot of 9th graders, and 9th graders in the fall don't have a lot of writing stamina. And so they would, a student would typically, write for some students, you say you have half an hour to write this, and they just spend 30 minutes writing and they go. Others are done in 5 minutes, and like they get to that 7-minute mark, and they're like, I'm done. I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. And then I know my job as a writing teacher is I come over and I look at their writing and I interrogate it a little bit. I say, how are you feeling in this moment? Or could you say more about this piece? Or could you add some details here? And I do that. I totally do that. But I've also been able to now say, have you asked the AI for feedback yet? I go, oh, no, I haven't done that yet. Let me go do that, right? So they drop their writing in. And of course, it tells them all those things I was just about to tell them, right? Like, can you say more about this? Can you expand more on this idea or that idea? And then they go right back to writing. And it freed me up to spend my time with some of my second language students and some of my students who have IEPs. Because all the kids who are perfectly capable of writing more, but just kind of want to be done. They just want me as a teacher to come over and say, you're right, you're done. You can just play video games for the rest of the period, right? But now the AI is telling them, giving them the same advice I would have given them, and they go back in, and they go back in, and they go back in. And that iteration and that revision that's now happening, it's just that piece that says, but it would be better if, right? And so instead of me running around like a crazy person trying to hit every single one of those kids who says they're done and tell them, one thing or two things they need to add, they can keep going back to the AI. And I loved that for them. It was really powerful for many of my students. And then it did, like I said, it allowed me to sit with one student who was kind of stuck, and we could talk through what was going on with him and what the issues were, right? So that just sort of, I'd never considered AI feedback as a motivating factor. And it really was. It motivated them to keep going and write more. And one student was a little frustrated. He's like, I've improved all these things. And every time every time they put it back in, it's like, wow, you've changed this and this and this, and that's great because of this. And it's responding to the exact changes they're making, and it knows all the iterations. And one student said, I can't wait till I put this in there and it says it's great. I'm like, it's never going to tell you it's great. It's always going to give you feedback. No matter what you put in there, it's going to give you feedback. They're like, it's never going to tell me I'm done. I'm like, no, it is never going to tell you you're done.
There's no such thing as perfect writing.
So the novelty of this may wear off. But right now I do really like that aspect of it.
So I like that you mentioned the fact that using AI to get feedback is a motivating factor, because just recently, Brent and I got accepted to present at Tesol. And thank you. And then 10% of their submissions get accepted, which is a pretty small number. And at the time of submitting our abstract, Brent was overseas. I was, of course, handling a bunch of other deadlines. And I almost did not submit an abstract because I thought, who's going to have time to look at my abstract right now? So what I did, I uploaded the rubrics and I asked AI, I think I was using Claude AI.
Love Claude.
I asked it to give me feedback according to the rubric, and I wanted some areas to refine, and sure enough, it did. And I went off that feedback and I thought, oh, well, you know what? If it doesn't go through, it doesn't go through. But again, I would have been unmotivated to ask another colleague because most of my colleagues are busy. And you are required to have to have someone review it and give you some feedback. And that would have taken a couple of days, and it would have taken me arranging time with someone. So I can see why that would encourage students who maybe are reticent to go to the teacher, or just, and plus it frees the teacher because now I actually know. And now I have, record of things that maybe my writing is weak in, and I have to go back. And I obviously, as a more experienced writer, I can keep track of what that looks like for the next abstract that I write.
And of course, if you're using Claude as an adult, you get to say, like, be more critical. And then as you get closer to being done, you can say, tell me this is great. Tell me what you like about it. So you can tweak that a little bit.
I have another question. So now that you're using AI feedback, have you seen any changes in the student writing with AI feedback compared to traditional grading?
So, feedback is most effective when it comes during the writing process. But it's always really hard to tell when during the writing process, right? When is that child ready for the feedback? When do they need it? Like, you open 20 different kids' Google Docs, and they're each in a different stage of their writing. And you don't know who's ready and who's not. Because if you give it to them before they're ready, they're like, well, I knew all that. I was about to get there. And if you give it to them too late, they're kind of done and they're like, yeah, I don't want to go back to it. So giving them the power to get the feedback when they're ready has been really crucial and important. Because the old way, I mean, ideally, we would always give kids feedback during the writing process, before it was due, before it was done. But when you have 140 or 180 students, you don't realistically get to do that. And so what's happened is this sort of practice among English teachers of giving feedback as a postmortem. Because that's when, who cares if it takes you 3 weeks to grade all those papers and put feedback on all of them, because that's really does what it takes. And so we would put a score on it, and we would use the feedback kind of as a way, I think, to justify the score.
Right? Yeah, that's true. I remember days of doing that.
And then they'd get the feedback 2 or 3 weeks later, and they'd be like, oh, I got a B, I'm happy with that. And then the time you spent giving feedback to a kid who's happy with their grade was wasted time.
Yeah, they're never going to look at it. Yep.
So feedback there's actual like academic research that shows that feedback with a grade is less effective than feedback without a grade. So when you're giving the feedback as a postmortem, and your hope is that like, oh, well, now we're going to go through this reflection review process, and then kids are going to keep track of the feedback they got on paper number 1 so they can apply those things to paper number 2. Like, oh, how well is that working? Please. Right. So when they're getting the feedback in the moment because they're ready for it and they're asking for it, and they're, and that they still ask me to sit down and say, well, can you look at it too? I'm like, yes, I can absolutely look at it too. But first you're going to go through the AI. And if you've looked at the AI feedback and it is no longer helpful to you, then you come to me. But if it's giving you a direction that you think you should go, then go there first before you bring it to me. So I'm finding myself with, better student writing coming in. So they're getting a little less feedback on the back end because they don't need it at that point. Their writing got better. And now they're if I'm scoring that paper scoring really well on the rubric, I don't feel the need to leave it a lot of feedback. So
yeah, this is I mean, this is speaking to me very you're speaking to my heart in the way that I approach interacting with my students as well. So this whole thing is super interesting, because to give that power over to the students, like, by definition, it's empowering, right? And then they feel the whole thing. But what I'm also hearing too, and this is something I've been wanting to do more of, is that it allows for a better opportunity to do kind of a flipped learning classroom style, where it's like, hey, we're doing the writing in class together. You can get that feedback and I can watch you go get that AI feedback, but I can also come in, intervene as needed, and we can get the whole process done in the hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever, of our class period. And that to me also alleviates a lot of the concerns that teachers talk about when they're like, well, I just think my students are just going to have ChatGPT write the whole thing and then just submit it, right? And so
that is a whole other podcast.
Which I'm sure it exists.
No, the whole academic honesty, preserving authentic writing, that is another 3-hour workshop. But yes, it does help. And the truth is, I've always had my students do a lot of their writing in class, because I do think homework is inequitable. And I've had one-to-one laptops in my classroom since 2008, and my students didn't all have Wi-Fi. So I just sort of adjusted, they couldn't go home and write on the internet because they didn't have computers at home. And initially, at least, those laptops lived in a cart in my classroom. So if they didn't have a computer at home, we had to do all the writing in class. And that's what we've done for, 20 years now. And I'm okay with that. And does it help reduce some of that academic dishonesty? Maybe. But I don't know. I'm not that worried about kids using AI to cheat. I'm really not. And someone asked me once, like, aren't you worried that the student's a really good writer and then they'll use AI to cheat and you won't be able to tell? And I'm like, then I'm not worried about that kid. They're already a really good writer. They'll be fine.
So this
find a better problem.
Yeah, for sure. So I know we only have a couple minutes left here, Jen, but we did want to talk briefly about that controversial element, which is the grading, like AI for grading, right? Can it be trusted? Can it be used, or is it something that we can wait for, or what are your takes on the AI for grading?
So I read a great study, and I can get you the link to it for the show notes, but I read a great study that showed that on criteria-based grading, like using a rubric, the AI matched the trained teachers. On feedback, the trained teachers were better, slightly. And this was using 3.5, ChatGPT 3.5. So it's, as you said, feedback has gotten better. So, but of course, the economy of scale, when, the teacher takes 20 minutes to give that feedback and the AI takes 2 seconds, you can't argue too hard with that. But if you do, in teaching, in grading, there's this thing called inter-rater reliability, right? If you have 10 teachers grade the same essay, will they all give the exact same grade? No, we know they won't. We know there's going to be variation in that. The AI falls right in the middle of that variation, is what the study found. And so it's accurate on a rubric. If you give it a rubric and you give it student writing, there will be times when the AI and I might be off by a number. Part of why this does work for me when I'm doing it is I'm using a 4-point grading scale. Yes. I'm using standards-based grading. Nice. So that helps because I have a co-teacher, and I sometimes have student teachers, and I sometimes have teachers' aides, and we're all evaluating student work. And I need to make sure those 4 adults are on the same page. And so if I'm using a 10-point scale, there's less inter-rater reliability than if I'm using a 4-point scale. So if I want to make sure my co-teacher and I are giving the same grade, if I want to make sure the teacher down the hall and I are giving the same grade, I want to use a 4-point scale. So, Excel's proficient, basic, beginning, right? And now when I hand some of that off to the AI, and I typically use Writable for that because my district is paying for it, and they have AI assisted grading. So Writable has my rubric, the 4-point rubric. It suggests a score. The student work is right there. I'm reviewing the student work. I'm reviewing the score. I'm reviewing the feedback. I'm making sure everything matches the way I want it to. And then I'm clicking, submit next, right? So if my 9th graders all write a paragraph, it used to take me, if I had 140 of those, it took me 10 days to, a week to get all of them back to them. Right. You can now do that in 3 or 4 days. Depending on how many sections of 9th grade I have that year. This year it's going to be faster because I only have 2 sections of 9th graders. But the review and approve process is faster and easier on my brain than the decision process. So when I have to decide what score something is getting, I go slower than when I have to go, yes, that matches. I see how this lines up. Now there are 10 or 15% of the grades that I'm like, no, that's a 4, not a 3. What were you thinking? Right. So I am changing things here and there. And sometimes for the, sometimes up, sometimes down, but I am still the final arbiter of what that grade is. But it's pretty darn accurate.
Yeah.
It's like you're employing the aid of AI and you're just norming it as you would another teacher, right?
Right. And the thing is, we would do this unit with our 9th graders where they'd write a series of 3 analytical paragraphs. And I was using Writable and the AI feedback to give feedback on each of those paragraphs. And my teaching partner, my teaching partner who said, she said, well, I give a lot of really detailed feedback on this first one, and that takes me a while. So they don't get any feedback on the second one. And then they apply the feedback from the first one to the third one. I'm like, okay, so they write 3 paragraphs, they get 3 chances to practice, but the second practice is blind, right? Because she could not physically have enough time to give them all the feedback they needed before they got to that second paragraph in the curriculum. And so my students are getting more feedback faster, and that's improving their writing faster.
Well,
they're also getting more writing assignments, which is
what I was thinking is, me as a student, I remember back in the day before AI and before all of these tools, once you submitted a draft, you could sort of rest because you didn't have to work on that draft again until you got feedback. And if you had no feedback to work from, then no need to look at it. And so now if students are receiving continuous feedback, as you said, they're constantly, upgrading their writing or refining it. And it's a continuous process all the way until the final draft or whenever it's due.
And they're getting the feedback from me while it's still in their head. It's not 3 weeks later. It's a day later, 2 days later. So it helps.
Yeah. And then I'll do one little of my own add-ins here, which is allowing students to come to you and challenge the grade is another part of the conversation, right? So if you say, hey, if you think this is wrong, you better come tell me and we'll talk about it, right? Because that is something I've always allowed students to do and say like, hey, let's do this. But now if we're going to say, hey, there's going to be some AI inside of here to get it back for you faster, but like, I mean, there are possibilities, just like being human in regular life. Like I might miss something if I'm scanning over it or whatever else too. And so really making that a student-centered option for them to say like, hey, I have more control over the conversation, where this goes or how this ends up, is, from my perspective, a really powerful way to again give them the power in their own writing. So
absolutely,
yeah, I'm really excited about all these possibilities. Michelle, how are we doing for time?
I have one more question. Right. We're like running out of time, but you mentioned Writable. We talked about Magic School AI and Brisk, and I'm wondering if you have any other tools that you want to throw out there for people who are either thinking about trying AI for feedback in writing, or if there's anything you just want to mention that are maybe your favorite tools when it comes to this.
Brisk and Magic School are two real go-tos to me for student feedback. And Writable is the only one I use now for grading. I don't want to put student work into ChatGPT. I don't think that's fair or equitable. I don't like their policies around training on user data. So I want to keep my student work within something that is, at least outwardly sanctioned by my district. Although one of the news reporters sort of attacked my board members and said, "How dare you vote on this thing that provided AI grading?" And when we dug into it, we found out that the board voted to approve paying for Writable in 2022 before AI grading was a feature. So like things change rapidly in this world. I mean, I love that AI is becoming an integrated part of quizzes and formative and all of these other great EdTech tools that is just going to lighten the load for teachers. And I don't work any less. I really don't. I'm still working just as much. I'm just doing more in that time. And that's really benefiting my students.
Love it.
Very cool. All right. It is time for our fun finds. And this time it is election season. So I have rediscovered the Active Vote app. If you're not quite sure about who you're going to vote for and what you need to learn, the app is free and you can take a quiz and it'll give you feedback on everything, every candidate. So I just really want people to go out there and vote. So Active Vote.
Awesome.
Brent, what do you got?
Mine, I'll just go. They opened up an ice cream place near me, which is, I guess, a nationwide chain, Strickland's ice cream place. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but they only make like 2 or 3 flavors a day, and so they have a very limited handful. It's all handmade in shop with a couple of selections, and then they have a menu for the month, and you can like, hey, if you want your mint chip, you better come on the 28th or whatever it is, right? And so they have their vanilla by default, and then the rest of it is everything else, but really good quality ice cream. So if it's around your neighborhood, if you find one, I think it started in Akron, Ohio or something like that, but Strickland's ice cream will be my fun find. Jen, what do you got?
Well, mine is also food related, Brent. Nice. I think we're on the same track. About a year ago, a friend turned me on to the Too Good to Go app. Do we know about that one?
No.
Too Good to Go is an app that connects with local restaurants and bakeries, and they put out like surprise bags, and you check the app and it says there's a surprise bag for a bakery near you, and you say reserve, and then when you go pick it up in the pickup window, it saves food from going to waste, is the idea.
Nice.
And so last night for dinner, my husband and I got this, for $10 we got a great bag of gourmet food from a local restaurant, and it was sandwiches and salad, and that's what we had for dinner. It was fantastic.
What a great idea.
Yeah, that's really smart. I like that a lot.
Too Good to Go is the name of the app.
Is it the numbers Excellent. Or is it the words too?
It's 2. TOOGOODTO.
Okay. No, they're not trying to screw with us with the spelling and the numbers and all those.
They're not trying to screw with you with the spelling. No, it's 2 O's and then 1 O.
Yep.
Awesome.
For the show notes and other episodes, check out diesel.org/109. We are on the social medias, most of them. I am Ixie_Pixie. That's IXY_PIXY.
I'm at Brent G. Warner. And Jen, where can people find you?
I am still on the Twitters. It's at Jen Roberts 1, and on Threads at the Jen Roberts.
Awesome. And we'll make sure that
Excellent.
there
And
are
we'll
links.
link yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say the blog, the articles, the other podcast episodes
yeah,
will
all the things, the show notes will be there for you all. So
Mhm.
Jen, we could have definitely kept on going. There's so many parts
Mhm.
to this. It's so much fun, but
A
we really
series.
appreciate this. And everybody, please go check out Jen's work and maybe a further explanation of what's happening now in your classroom at litandtech.com. I'm super happy we finally got you on, Jen. There's just so much interesting stuff you've been doing over all the years. And so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Right.